Okay, so we're in chapter 2 of Daniel. And the main statement Daniel made last week, there is a God in heaven. So last week, we were looking at verses 27 and 28. Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in your bed are these." So basically, he's telling him help is on the way. So he comes before the king, tells him that he is able to reveal the secret, but he makes it real plain that it is not through any superior wisdom of his own that he is able to do it. He tells him that God did it. God does all of it. It was God that had this great king who was brought to the end of all human resources. If he had been able to remember his dream, he never would have realized that he had to deal with God. He first had to be brought to the end of all human wisdom and ability. So he had to come to a place where all of us need to come at times, intellectual poverty. We have to learn our own nothingness and ignorance, and the nothingness and ignorance of all the wise men of the world, or as we call them today, the experts. Only then could the matchless wisdom of God be revealed to him, and the same lesson must be learned by us. As Dallas Willard said, God's address is at the end of your rope. So if we are going to learn of God, we have to learn the poverty of our own resources first. So that brings us to verse 29. Here's what Daniel says: "To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this, and he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be." So the God of heaven has given you this dream, he's telling him. And Daniel proceeds to remind Nebuchadnezzar that before he had fallen asleep, he was actually thinking about the future. So that kind of tells you what was the king doing? He was worrying. He was worrying. Then verse 30. "But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind." Same thing. Daniel basically saying, I'm nothing special. Trust me. And he just he lays it out. I can't take any credit for any of this. I'm not special. I'm not anybody better than all of your other fellas here in Babylon. It's all God. God is the revealer of secrets. He has done it for his own purposes. So Daniel is the extreme example of true humility. He has it right with the Lord. The man for a crisis is rightly related to other people. He loves them and he doesn't think of himself as better than anybody else. And that's a key for all of us to understand. Humility is kind of the beginning of being able to help other people. If you're not humble about it, they usually don't listen. C.S. Lewis said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less." And that is so true. So the dream, before proceeding to the dream, however, Daniel once more emphasizes the fact that the secret had not come to him from any natural or accrued wisdom or from Babylon's great library, none of that. It's not human, but divine revelation. God, in his providence, selected Nebuchadnezzar as the recipient of the dream and Daniel as its interpreter. So they're hand in hand in this situation. Nebuchadnezzar and all the others should receive this revelation from Daniel. So the expression that the interpretation may be made known to the king is actually a passive in the grammar. So the construction is actually impersonal. So it's not just for Nebuchadnezzar. The phrase actually states it's for all people throughout history because it's a passive, not possessive. And this is God's purpose. So this interpretation is not only for Nebuchadnezzar, it's for all of us. And God is the God of purpose. So it was important for Nebuchadnezzar to receive this revelation since he was to be the first Gentile king in a significant period of history. And that period of history is called the times of the Gentiles. And Daniel is now able to proceed right to the dream. So the dream, it's kind of condensed into verses 31 to 45. And it revealed events that would take place over a long span of time, and the culmination, however, was to take place in the last days. So there's a hint right there of what's going on. And it has always been and always will be the lot of nations. The truth of the matter is that the kingdoms of men will go the way of all flesh and ultimately end in collapse and ruin. That's just the way it is. Anything based on the might of man, anything established on the wisdom of man will suffer the same kind of deterioration that man himself suffers since the fall. That's when it all started. And America is crumbling. It's been crumbling for years. We're all watching, and we who know Christ, we know the fall of the United States will come. As sad as it is, it shouldn't shock us. It's just following the same process. And it's devolutionary. It is not evolutionary, like people would like us to believe, like science tells us. Man is not ascending, man is descending. As it says in 2 Timothy, while evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. So things don't get better, they get worse. They've been doing it for a long time. And we've been seeing the moral decay of society. Nationally, socially, domestically, individually, organically, all things in this world are caught in a process of deterioration that began when men fell into sin in the garden. So in the history of empires, the dissolution of man-made effort is inevitable. So that history, as studied, becomes a succession of defeats. An empire begins, reaches a peak, fades and dies, and another one is built out of its ashes. We are looking at America. America in the past reached an apex. We're on the downside now, the back slope of history. And we see corruption everywhere. Rise of crime, lax criminal justice. We are constantly being corrupted at a faster rate through materialism, alcohol, drugs, sex, total selfishness. And we can go on and on. We are deteriorating just like every other nation has deteriorated. And in essence, we are part of that clay, because built into America is the same basic problem. We have feet of clay, like the image we will see in Daniel, and it represents the seed of men. Okay, Alexander Tyler, he was a Scottish historian. Over 200 years ago, he stated, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves money from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy will always collapse over loose fiscal policy, always followed by dictatorship." 200 years ago, he said that. Man. And he went on and said, of the world's greatest civilizations has lasted approximately 200 years. Well, for us, that 200 years was in 1976. So he had this cycle of how nations develop. Start with bondage, to spiritual faith, to courage, then to liberty, and that's actually the spot where things start going haywire. And he called it the development of misplaced liberty. And then that goes to abundance, selfishness, complacency, apathy, then dependence. And he said a point of degeneration when no systematic change will help. Yeah, it's actually a very truthful cycle. You can kind of lay this up against any kingdom, especially of the last 300, 400 years, and this is what happens. Now, by the way, it might shock you to know that democracy is not God's form of government. Never was, never will be. It is theocracy, where one person rules. Now, humanism tries to define theocracy as the rule of a religious elite. That isn't what theocracy is. Under that definition, Islam actually fits. So the only person who can rule is God. The world today, then, is simply going through the same cycle of dissolution that it has always endured. And there remains but one more scene, and that final scene is in the latter days and the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. If we step close to the book of Daniel, and behind the curtain, we can hear the commotion of the stagehands as they set up the machinery and set the last stage. And that's basically what we will be seeing here in these next few verses in chapter 2. Not only in chapter 2, but throughout the whole book of Daniel, to the end of the book, the unfolding of the last act on the stage of human history. As Luke 21:24 said, Jesus said this, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So according to this verse, Jerusalem is still being trampled by the Gentile nations. It had already begun at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and it would come to an end at the coming of Christ. And King Nebuchadnezzar is God's tool in starting the whole thing. And we need to remember that. Yeah, he was a smart guy. He had a lot of skill, but all of that came from God. He is God's tool. As Ezekiel 21 said, Ezekiel tells us that the glory had departed from Israel. It had left. God looks at himself as the sword of justice, and he hands that sword to Nebuchadnezzar. So when Israel went into captivity, God just moved away. And that term, Ichabod, it comes from the book of Samuel. The glory is departed from Israel. The second chapter of Daniel then indicates that God transfers the leadership of the earth from the Jewish nation and from Israel to the Gentile nations. And Israel takes a back seat. Deuteronomy 32 said, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. So they're still his people. They're just in the background right now. So what God intended originally for the Jews didn't happen because of their sin. Psalm 2, 6 and 7. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. So it hasn't happened yet, but it will. God says, I will declare the decree the Lord has said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. So God's plan is for Zion to finally be the resting place of the feet of Jesus Christ when he returns. And so what we're going to see next is kind of history in a nutshell. And we will see how God's purpose takes it through the whole scenes of human history. God wanted the Jews to know that this was not going to be a permanent place for them. So in essence, he's giving them a look at what's going to happen in the future. Jeremiah 29 said, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. And that future is still in the future. Israel's future has not been fulfilled. So has God forgotten his covenant? That's what a lot of people think. Is this the end? Are all the promises lost? No. And so comes immediately this fantastic, incredible revelation in the book of Daniel. The vision shall come to pass. And that's basically what Daniel is saying to Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to happen. And that brings us to verse 31, and we'll stop right there and pick it up, not next week, but the week after. So let's close with a word of prayer.